The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile hospital corridor as Sarah Martinez pushed her wheelchair down the familiar hallway. 3 months had passed since the IED explosion in Afghanistan that shattered her left leg and ended her career as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. The physical wounds were healing, but the invisible scars ran deeper than any surgeon could reach. She had grown accustomed to the pitying looks from staff members who knew her story. "Former Army medic," they would whisper when they thought she couldn't hear. Such a shame, so young. But Sarah had learned to keep her head high and her expression neutral. She refused to be defined by what happened to her in that dusty village outside Kandahar. The physical therapy session had been particularly challenging today. Her new prosthetic leg felt foreign and clumsy, nothing like the strong limbs that had carried her through 2 deployments. Dr. Peterson, her therapist, had been encouraging as always, but Sarah could see the concern in her eyes. Progress was slower than expected, and everyone was trying to stay positive while dancing around the obvious question nobody wanted to ask. As she rounded the corner toward the elevator, Sarah heard raised voices coming from conference room B. Through the partially open door, she caught glimpses of men in military dress uniforms. A meeting was clearly in progress, and she tried to wheel past quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever important discussion was taking place. But something made her pause. One of the voices carried a tone of authority she recognized immediately, the kind that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. It reminded her of her commanding officers, of the weight that came with responsibility for other people's lives. "The new recruits are struggling with the medical protocols," the voice was saying. "We need someone who understands combat medicine, someone who's been there and knows what it's really like when everything goes wrong." Sarah found herself listening despite her better judgment. She had always been curious, a trait that had served her well in the field but sometimes got her into trouble. Her hand hovered over the elevator button, but she couldn't quite bring herself to press it. "What about the training program at Bragg?" another voice suggested. "They've got some good instructors there." "Theory and practice are 2 different things," the first voice replied. "These guys are going into some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They need to learn from someone who's actually saved lives under fire, not just someone who's read about it in a manual." The conversation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about her own experiences. The chaos of treating wounded soldiers while bullets flew overhead. The weight of making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Those memories were both her greatest source of pride and her deepest source of pain. She had saved 17 lives during her deployments. She could recite each name, each injury, each moment when she had managed to keep someone breathing long enough to get them to safety. But she could also remember the 3 she couldn't save. The faces that visited her in the quiet moments when sleep wouldn't come. The wheelchair squeaked slightly as she shifted her weight, and the voices in the room paused. Sarah held her breath, hoping they hadn't noticed her presence. She felt like an eavesdropper, which technically she was, but something about their conversation had grabbed her attention, in a way nothing had for months. The problem is finding someone with the right combination of experience and teaching ability, the discussion continued. Most of our best medics are still active duty, and the ones who've transitioned out, well, many of them want to put that life behind them. Sarah understood that sentiment all too well. There were days when she wished she could forget everything she had learned about trauma medicine, could unlearn the automatic responses that kicked in every time she heard a car backfire or saw someone fall. But there were also moments when she missed the clarity of purpose that had defined her military service. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and Sarah finally pressed the button to hold the doors open. She took one last look at the conference room, wondering what kind of training program they were discussing and why it seemed to matter so much to them. As the elevator descended to the ground floor, she found herself thinking about the conversation she had overheard. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as just another military meeting that had nothing to do with her current life. She was a patient now, not a soldier, and her focus needed to be on her own recovery. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to helping others, couldn't let go of what she had heard. There were people out there who needed training, who might benefit from the hard-earned knowledge she carried. The question was whether she was ready to share that knowledge, and whether anyone would want to learn from someone who now rolled instead of walked. The elevator reached the lobby, and Sarah wheeled herself toward the main entrance. The autumn air was crisp and clean, a welcome change from the recycled hospital atmosphere. She had an appointment with her counselor in an hour, another part of her recovery process that she approached with mixed feelings. Dr. Williams was kind and professional, but Sarah often felt like she was speaking a different language when she tried to explain what combat had been like. How could she describe the adrenaline rush of saving a life under fire to someone who had never been in that situation? How could she convey the pride and the guilt that came intertwined in equal measure? As she waited for her ride, Sarah found herself replaying the conversation from the conference room. Something about it felt significant, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was the reminder that her skills and experience still had value, even if her body had changed. Maybe it was the possibility that there might be a way to serve again, even if it looked different than before. The car pulled up to the curb, and Sarah began the familiar process of transferring from her wheelchair to the passenger seat. It was getting easier with practice, but it still felt like a small victory each time she managed it smoothly. As they drove away from the hospital, she stared out the window at the world rushing past and wondered what the future might hold. Dr. Williams had a way of asking questions that made Sarah feel like she was being gently dissected. The counselor's office was designed to be calming, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture, but Sarah always felt exposed sitting there. Today was no different as she settled into her usual chair, her prosthetic leg positioned carefully to appear as natural as possible. "How are you feeling about the physical therapy progress?" Dr. Williams asked, her pen poised over a notepad that Sarah suspected contained far more observations than she was comfortable with. "It's fine," Sarah replied automatically. It was her standard response to most questions these days, a safe answer that didn't invite further probing. But Dr. Williams had been working with veterans long enough to recognize deflection when she heard it. "Fine is the interesting word," the counselor said with a slight smile. "It can mean anything from genuinely okay to barely holding it together." "Which end of that spectrum are we talking about today?" Sarah shifted in her chair, annoyed by how easily Dr. Williams could see through her carefully constructed facade. "The leg is getting stronger. I'm learning to use the prosthetic. Progress is being made. That's the clinical assessment. What about the emotional side? How are you processing the changes in your life?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah had become an expert at discussing her physical recovery in medical terms, but the emotional aspect was territory she preferred to avoid. It was too messy, too unpredictable, and too much like admitting weakness. "I'm adjusting," she said finally. "Everyone keeps telling me that this is just a new chapter, that there are still opportunities ahead. I'm trying to believe that." Dr. Williams set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. Trying to believe and actually believing are different things. What would it look like if you truly believed there were opportunities ahead? The question caught Sarah off guard because it forced her to imagine a future beyond just surviving each day. For months, her goals had been simple: heal enough to walk again, regain some independence, and figure out how to exist in a world that suddenly felt foreign. The idea of actually having aspirations beyond basic functioning seemed almost foreign. "I don't know," she admitted, and for the first time in the session, her voice carried genuine emotion instead of careful control. "I used to know exactly who I was and what I was good at. I was a combat medic. I saved lives. I had a purpose that felt bigger than myself. And now I'm a patient. I'm the one who needs help instead of giving it. I'm learning to walk again like a toddler, except toddlers don't have to deal with phantom pain and PTSD flashbacks while they're figuring out how to put one foot in front of the other." The words came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended, and she immediately felt the urge to retreat back into her protective shell. But Dr. Williams didn't look alarmed or concerned. If anything, she looked relieved, as if Sarah had finally said something real. "That must feel like a complete identity shift," Dr. Williams said. "From being the person who provides life-saving care to being the person who receives care. That's a profound change." Sarah nodded, surprised by how accurately the counselor had captured something she had been struggling to articulate. "I keep having dreams where I'm back in Afghanistan and someone's calling for a medic, and I try to run to help but my leg won't work. I wake up feeling like I've failed someone. Do you think your value as a person was entirely tied to your ability to perform that specific job?" The question stung because it hit too close to home. Sarah had always been the reliable one, the competent one, the person others could count on in a crisis. Her identity had been built around being useful, being needed, being the one who had answers when everything was falling apart. "Maybe," she said quietly. "I don't know how to be anything else." They sat in silence for a moment, and Sarah found herself thinking again about the conversation she had overheard at the hospital, the voices discussing the need for someone with combat medical experience, someone who understood what it was really like to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. "What if," Dr. Williams said carefully, "your experience as a combat medic wasn't something you used to be but something you still are, just in a different context?" "What do you mean?" "Well, you still have all that knowledge, all that experience. You still understand trauma medicine better than most people ever will. You've still saved those 17 lives, and that knowledge didn't disappear when you were injured." Sarah felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months. Not quite hope, but curiosity. "But I can't do that job anymore. I can't run to someone who's been shot. I can't carry wounded soldiers to safety." "Maybe not. But are those the only ways to use medical knowledge to save lives?" The question lingered in Sarah's mind as the session ended, and she made her way back to the hospital for another round of physical therapy. Dr. Peterson was waiting with her usual encouraging smile and a new set of exercises designed to improve her balance and coordination. "You seem different today," the therapist observed as Sarah worked through the routine. "More focused, maybe?" "Just thinking about some things," Sarah replied, concentrating on maintaining her balance as she navigated between parallel bars. The prosthetic still felt awkward, but she was beginning to understand its rhythm, the way it responded to her movements. "Good thinking or difficult thinking?" "Both, I guess. Someone asked me a question today that I'm still trying to answer." Dr. Peterson nodded knowingly. "Those are often the most important questions, the ones that don't have easy answers." As Sarah worked through her exercises, she found herself thinking about all the young medics she had trained during her deployments. She remembered their eager faces, their nervousness during their first real emergency, the way they had looked to her for guidance when everything was chaos around them. She had been good at teaching, she realized. Not just good at the medical procedures themselves, but good at explaining them under pressure, good at helping others stay calm when adrenaline was pumping and stakes were high. Those skills hadn't been damaged in the explosion that took her leg. When the session ended, Sarah made an impulsive decision. Instead of heading directly to the elevator, she wheeled herself back toward conference room B. The door was closed now, but she could see a piece of paper taped to the window with what looked like contact information. She positioned herself where she could read it without being obvious. "Commander Jake Morrison, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Combat Medical Training Initiative." Below that was a phone number and an email address. Sarah memorized the information, her heart beating faster than it had in months. She didn't know what she was planning to do with it, but something about having the contact felt like possibility. For the first time since her injury, she felt like she might have something to offer the world beyond just getting better. The elevator ride down felt different this time, charged with potential instead of just routine. She still didn't know what the future looked like, but for the first time in months she was genuinely curious to find out. Sarah stared at her laptop screen for the third time that morning, the cursor blinking mockingly in the empty email composition window. She had typed and deleted the same message at least a dozen times over the past week, each attempt feeling either too desperate, too formal, or too presumptuous. How did you reach out to a Navy SEAL commander and offer your services when you weren't even sure what those services might be? The apartment around her was quiet except for the steady tick of the wall clock, a sound that had become both comforting and irritating during her recovery. She had moved into this single-story unit specifically because it was wheelchair accessible, but every design choice reminded her of how much her life had changed. The lowered countertops, the wide doorways, the roll-in shower, all practical, modifications that felt like permanent admissions of limitation. Her physical therapy session yesterday had gone well. Dr. Peterson had been pleased with her progress, noting improvements in her balance and endurance. But Sarah knew that walking with a prosthetic in a controlled environment was vastly different from the physical demands of active duty. She would never again sprint across uneven terrain carrying a wounded soldier, never again crawl through debris to reach someone who needed help. But that didn't mean her knowledge was useless. She flexed her fingers and started typing again. This time forcing herself to keep going even when the words felt inadequate. Commander Morrison, my name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm a former combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. I overheard part of a conversation last week regarding training needs for combat medical protocols. I believe I may have relevant experience that could be beneficial to your program. She paused, then continued before she could second-guess herself. I served 2 deployments in Afghanistan and have extensive experience treating trauma injuries under fire. I'm currently recovering from an injury that ended my active duty service, but I'm interested in exploring ways to continue contributing to military medical training. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss how my experience might align with your program's needs. Sarah read through the message twice, made a few minor edits, and then clicked send before she could lose her nerve. The moment the email disappeared, from her outbox, she felt a mixture of relief and terror. There was no taking it back now. Her phone rang almost immediately, and for a wild moment she thought it might be Commander Morrison calling. But the caller ID showed her sister Maria's name, and Sarah felt both disappointment and relief. Hey, sis. Maria's voice was cheerful, but Sarah could hear the underlying concern that had been present in all their conversations since the injury. How's the therapy going? Good progress, Sarah replied automatically. Dr. Peterson says I'm ahead of schedule on some of the milestones. That's great. Are you feeling up for visitors this weekend? Mom wants to come down, and you know how she gets when she's worried about you. Sarah loved her family, but their visits often left her feeling drained. Everyone tried so hard to be positive and encouraging that the conversations felt forced, like performances where everyone was reading from scripts about overcoming adversity and finding new purpose. Sure, that would be nice, she said, already mentally preparing for the emotional labor of reassuring everyone that she was okay. Sarah? Maria's voice shifted to the tone that meant she was about to say something she thought was important. I know you're doing well with the physical recovery, but have you thought about what comes next? I mean, beyond getting back on your feet? It was the question everyone was thinking, but most people were too polite to ask directly. What do you do when the career that defined your entire adult life is suddenly impossible? I'm exploring some options, Sarah said, which was technically true even though she had just sent her first exploratory email 30 seconds ago. That's good to hear. You know, my friend Jessica's husband works for a medical device company, and they're always looking for people with clinical experience. It might be something to consider. Sarah made appropriate noises about considering it, but the suggestion felt hollow. She appreciated that people wanted to help, but most of the career suggestions she received felt like consolation prizes, ways to use fragments of her former skills in situations that had none of the urgency or purpose that had driven her before. After they hung up, Sarah found herself staring at her empty email inbox, willing it to show a response that she knew was unlikely to come so quickly. Commander Morrison probably received dozens of emails every day from people wanting to be involved with special operations training. Why would he respond to a medic he had never heard of? But as the day wore on, Sarah discovered that sending the email had changed something fundamental in her mindset. Instead of just enduring her physical therapy exercises, she found herself pushing harder, imagining scenarios where she might need to demonstrate her knowledge and competence. Instead of viewing her prosthetic as a limitation, she started thinking about how to work with it effectively. That evening, she did something she hadn't done since before her injury. She pulled out her medical textbooks and training manuals. The familiar weight of the books felt comforting as she spread them across her kitchen table. She started reviewing trauma protocols, refreshing her memory on procedures she could perform in her sleep during deployment but hadn't thought about in months. As she read, she realized how much specialized knowledge she had accumulated during her military service. It wasn't just about bandaging wounds or starting IVs. She understood the psychological aspects of treating trauma under extreme stress, the logistics of medical care in hostile environments, the split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between life and death. More importantly, she understood how to teach these skills to others. During her deployments, she had trained dozens of junior medics, helping them transition from classroom knowledge to real-world application. She remembered the satisfaction of watching a nervous private successfully handle their first major trauma case, knowing that her guidance had helped them save a life. Her laptop chimed with an incoming email notification, and Sarah's heart jumped. But it was just a promotional message from a medical supply company, not the response she was hoping for. She closed the laptop and returned to her textbooks, reminding herself that meaningful opportunities rarely happened overnight. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was studying with purpose instead of just trying to fill empty hours. Whether or not Commander Morrison responded to her email, she was remembering who she had been before the explosion. Not just a soldier, but a teacher, a healer, and someone who had dedicated her life to serving others. As she worked through the night, Sarah began to understand what Dr. Williams had meant about her experience being something she still was, not just something she used to be. The knowledge was still there, refined by years of practical application and tested under the most extreme circumstances possible. Now she just needed to find a way to use it. The response came 3 days later, just as Sarah was beginning to convince herself that her email had been ignored or deleted. She was in the middle of a particularly challenging physical therapy session when her phone buzzed with a notification. Dr. Peterson noticed her distraction immediately. "Important message?" the therapist asked as Sarah struggled to maintain focus on her balance exercises. "Maybe," Sarah replied, trying to sound casual while her heart raced. "I'll check it after we finish." But concentration proved impossible. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward her phone sitting on the nearby bench. Dr. Peterson finally took pity on her and called an early end to the session. "Go check your message," she said with an understanding smile. "But remember, good news or bad news, you still need to finish your exercises later today." Sarah's hand shook slightly as she opened her email. The message was brief and professional, but it contained exactly what she had been hoping for. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for your inquiry regarding our combat medical training program. Your background and experience are potentially relevant to our current needs. Would you be available for a phone conversation tomorrow at 1400 hours to discuss this further? Commander Jake Morrison, NSW Development Group." Sarah read the message 3 times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. A phone conversation wasn't a job offer, but it was more than she had dared to hope for. She quickly typed a response confirming her availability, then spent the rest of the day alternating between excitement and terror about what she might be getting herself into. That evening, she called Dr. Williams to share the development. The counselor's response was characteristically thoughtful. "How are you feeling about this opportunity?" Dr. Williams asked. "Nervous, excited, terrified that I'm not ready for something like this," Sarah admitted. "What if I've been fooling myself about what I have to offer?" "What if you haven't been fooling yourself? What if your instinct about this is correct?" It was the kind of question Dr. Williams specialized in, one that forced Sarah to consider possibilities she was afraid to acknowledge. She had spent so many months focused on her limitations that imagining her strengths felt almost foreign. The next day arrived with agonizing slowness. Sarah spent the morning reviewing her military service record, refreshing her memory on specific cases and procedures she might be asked about. She practiced walking with her prosthetic, wanting to sound confident and capable during the phone call. At exactly 1400 hours, her phone rang. "Ms. Martinez, this is Commander Morrison. Thank you for making time to speak with me today." His voice was exactly as she remembered from the overheard conversation, authoritative but not intimidating, the kind of tone that commanded respect without demanding it. "Thank you for responding to my email, Commander," Sarah replied, grateful that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I've reviewed your service record," Morrison continued, "and I'm impressed by your experience. 2 deployments, multiple commendations, and according to your file, you trained over 40 junior medics during your service. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. Training was always a significant part of my responsibilities, especially during my second deployment when we had a lot of new personnel rotating in." "Tell me about that. What was the biggest challenge in training medics for combat situations?" Sarah found herself relaxing as she moved into familiar territory. The biggest challenge was bridging the gap between classroom knowledge and real-world application. These soldiers knew the procedures, but they hadn't experienced the chaos, the noise, the pressure of making life and death decisions while bullets are flying overhead. "How did you address that?" Scenario-based training with increasing levels of stress. We started with basic procedures under controlled conditions, then gradually added complications, loud noises, time pressure, multiple casualties, equipment failures. By the time they saw their first real combat situation, they had already experienced something similar in training. Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Sarah wondered if she had said something wrong. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more conversational. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. We're developing a new training program for special operations medics, and we need someone who understands combat medicine from a practical perspective. Most of our current instructors are excellent at teaching procedures, but they haven't been in the field recently enough to understand current challenges." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of program are you developing?" "Advanced trauma care under extreme conditions. These medics will be operating in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth, often without backup or evacuation options. They need to be able to make decisions that regular military medics might never face. And you think I might be qualified to help with this training?" "Based on your record and this conversation, yes. But I need to be upfront about something. This would involve working with active duty special operations personnel. The environment can be intense and the standards are extremely high. Would you be comfortable in that setting?" The question hit at the heart of Sarah's deepest insecurity. Would she be comfortable being the only person in the room who couldn't keep up physically? Would the operators respect someone who arrived in a wheelchair? But as she considered the question, Sarah realized that her concerns were based on assumptions rather than facts. These operators needed medical knowledge, not someone who could run a 6-minute mile. They needed someone who could teach them to save lives under pressure, not someone who could carry them to safety. "Commander, I won't pretend that my injury hasn't changed my capabilities, but my knowledge and experience are intact. If you need someone who can teach advanced trauma protocols and help operators prepare for worst-case scenarios, then yes, I believe I would be comfortable in that environment. When would you be available to visit our facility? I'd like you to observe one of our current training sessions and meet some of the instructors. Consider it a mutual evaluation. You can see if this is something you're interested in, and we can assess how you might fit into our program." Sarah's mind raced. This was happening faster than she had anticipated, but she didn't want to seem hesitant or unprepared. "I could make time next week, depending on the day. I have some ongoing medical appointments, but I can work around them. How about Thursday at Oro 900? I'll send you directions to our facility. Plan on spending most of the day with us." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at her phone, hardly believing what had just happened. 3 months ago, she had been convinced that her career in military medicine was over. Now she had an opportunity to contribute to special operations training, to use her experience in ways she had never imagined possible. But opportunity also meant risk. If she wasn't good enough, if her limitations became obstacles rather than manageable challenges, she would be publicly failing at something that mattered deeply to her. It would be easier to stay safe in her recovery routine, focusing on small improvements rather than taking big chances. Sarah looked around her apartment, at the accessibility modifications, the medical equipment, the carefully organized space that had become her entire world. It was comfortable and safe, but it wasn't enough anymore. She opened her laptop and began researching the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, preparing for an interview that might change everything. The Naval Special Warfare Facility was unlike any military installation Sarah had visited before. Security was tight but efficient, and within minutes of arriving she found herself being escorted through corridors that seemed to hum with purpose. The walls were lined with photographs and awards that told stories of operations she would never hear about, victories that would remain classified long after she was gone. Commander Morrison met her in the main lobby, and Sarah was relieved to discover that her initial impression from their phone conversation had been accurate. He was clearly someone accustomed to command, but he possessed the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself through intimidation. "Ms. Martinez, welcome to our facility," he said, offering a firm handshake before glancing briefly at her wheelchair. If he had any concerns about her mobility, they didn't show on his face. "I thought we'd start with a tour, then observe one of our current training sessions." As they moved through the building, Morrison explained the facility's mission and the specific challenges they were trying to address. The special operations community was evolving rapidly, He explained, with missions becoming more complex and operators often working in environments where traditional medical support wasn't available, our medics need to be prepared for scenarios that go beyond standard combat medicine, he said as they passed a classroom where operators were studying anatomical charts, prolonged care situations, improvised equipment, treating injuries we've never seen before because the enemy is constantly developing new weapons. Sarah found herself nodding along, recognizing the challenges he described from her own experience. During her second deployment, she had treated injuries from improvised explosive devices that created wound patterns unlike anything in the textbooks. Innovation and adaptation had been essential skills, not just medical knowledge. They entered an observation area overlooking a large training room where a class was in progress. Below them, a group of operators in military fatigues were working through trauma scenarios with training dummies. The instructor, a Navy corpsman with multiple deployment patches on his uniform, was walking them through chest tube insertion procedures. The instruction is technically sound, Morrison said quietly, but watch their stress levels. They're comfortable because this is familiar territory. Sarah observed the operators carefully. They were clearly competent and well-trained, moving through the procedures with confidence. But Morrison was right. There was a relaxed quality to their movements that suggested they weren't being challenged beyond their comfort zone. "Now watch this," Morrison said, pressing a button on a control panel. Suddenly, the training room filled with loud explosion sounds. Strobe lights began flashing, and smoke started pouring from hidden vents. The instructor began shouting over the noise, adding time pressure and additional casualties to the scenario. The change in the operators was immediate and dramatic. Movements that had been smooth and confident became hurried and uncertain. Sarah watched one operator struggle to maintain his grip on medical instruments as the noise and chaos disrupted his concentration. Another froze momentarily when confronted with multiple casualties and no clear priority system. "This is closer to reality," Morrison said, "but even this doesn't fully capture what they'll face in the field. We need someone who can help them prepare for situations where everything goes wrong simultaneously." As Sarah watched the training exercise continue, she found herself mentally cataloging the mistakes she was seeing and thinking about how she would address them. The operators were making errors she had seen countless times in her own students, focusing too narrowly on procedures while losing sight of the bigger picture, letting stress override their training, failing to adapt when circumstances changed. "What's the current pass rate for this training?" she asked. "About 70% complete the program successfully, but completion and competence aren't the same thing. We need operators who don't just pass the course, but who can perform under the worst possible conditions." After the training session ended, Morrison introduced Sarah to several of the instructors. They were all experienced military medics with impressive credentials, but as she spoke with them, Sarah began to understand what Morrison meant about needing someone with recent combat experience. Most of the instructors had been in training roles for several years, which meant their knowledge was current, but their field experience was becoming dated. They were excellent at teaching established procedures, but they lacked the recent practical experience that came from actually treating trauma injuries under fire. "What kind of specific improvements are you looking for?" Sarah asked during a break between sessions. "More realistic scenario training, better stress inoculation, and advanced decision-making under pressure," Morrison replied. "We also need someone who can help operators understand the psychological aspects of combat medicine, how to stay focused when everything is chaos, how to make life and death decisions quickly, and live with the consequences." Those last words hit Sarah particularly hard because they described exactly the skills she had developed during her deployments. She had learned to compartmentalize emotions during treatment, to make rapid triage decisions when resources were limited, and to carry the weight of outcomes that weren't always successful. "Commander, can I ask you something directly?" Sarah said. "You have plenty of qualified instructors already. What makes you think I would add value to this program?" Morrison smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "Because every instructor I have can teach procedures perfectly in a controlled environment. But when I read your service record, I see someone who successfully treated trauma casualties under direct enemy fire, who made improvised medical decisions when standard protocols weren't sufficient, and who trained junior medics while deployed in active combat zones." He paused, looking directly at her. I need someone who has been tested under the worst possible circumstances and performed successfully. Your injury doesn't change that experience or make that knowledge less valuable. The afternoon continued with more classroom observations and discussions with training staff. Sarah found herself becoming increasingly engaged as she saw opportunities to contribute meaningful improvements to the program. Her mind was already working on scenario designs that would better prepare operators for the realities they would face. As the day concluded, Morrison walked her back to the main entrance. "Ms. Martinez, I want to be completely transparent with you. This would be a challenging position. You'd be working with some of the most elite operators in the military, and the standards are unforgiving. But based on what I've seen today, I believe you have the knowledge and experience we need." "What would the next steps be?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with how ready she felt to move forward. "I'd like to offer you a trial period. 2 weeks working with our current program, observing and providing input. If it goes well for both of us, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was the opportunity she hadn't even known she was looking for. A chance to serve again, to use her experience in ways that could make a real difference. "I'm interested," she said simply. Morrison extended his hand again. "Welcome to the team, Ms. Martinez. We'll start Monday morning at 800. As Sarah drove away from the facility, she realized that for the first time since her injury, she was looking forward to Monday morning. She had found a way to serve again, to use her knowledge and experience in service of something larger than herself. The future was no longer something she was afraid of. It was something she was excited to discover. Monday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy Sarah hadn't felt since her first day of basic training. She had spent the weekend preparing, reviewing her notes, and planning her approach to observing the existing training program. But as she wheeled herself through the facility's entrance at 0755, she realized that no amount of preparation could have readied her for the reality of working alongside active-duty special operations personnel. The training room was already occupied when she arrived. 8 operators in full gear were conducting equipment checks, their movements efficient and purposeful. These weren't the relaxed students she had observed during her visit. These were seasoned professionals preparing for advanced training, and the atmosphere was notably more intense. Commander Morrison appeared at her side as she positioned herself in the observation area. "This is our senior medic course," he explained quietly. "All of these operators have completed basic training and have field experience. They're here for advanced protocols and scenario training." The lead instructor, a Navy corpsman named Petty Officer Thompson, called the group to attention and began outlining the day's objectives. Sarah listened carefully, noting the complexity of the scenarios they would be working through. These were situations that went far beyond standard combat medicine. Extended care situations, resource scarcity, and multiple casualty events with no immediate evacuation options. As the first scenario began, Sarah found herself leaning forward in her wheelchair, completely absorbed in watching the operators work. The scenario involved a helicopter crash in hostile territory with multiple RA injuries and limited medical supplies. The operators had to establish triage priorities, treat life-threatening injuries, and prepare casualties for a delayed evacuation. Within minutes, Sarah began noticing patterns and problems that the current instructors seemed to be missing. The operators were technically proficient, but they were making strategic errors that could have serious consequences in real situations. Their triage decisions were based too heavily on established protocols without enough consideration for the specific circumstances they were facing. During a break between scenarios, Commander Morrison approached her. "What are you seeing?" "They're good," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to criticize the existing program too harshly. "Their technical skills are solid, but they're thinking too rigidly about procedures instead of principles. In a real situation with those constraints, some of their decisions would cost lives." "Can you be more specific?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided to be direct. In the helicopter crash scenario, they treated the most severely injured casualty first because that's what the protocol says. But given their resource limitations and the delayed evacuation timeline, they should have focused on casualties they could stabilize quickly to maximize the number of lives saved. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of insight we need. Would you be comfortable sharing that observation with the instructors?" The suggestion made Sarah's stomach tighten. Critiquing the program as an observer was one thing, but offering direct feedback to experienced instructors was entirely different. These were seasoned professionals who had been teaching special operations medicine for years. Who was she to suggest improvements? But as she watched the next scenario unfold, Sarah saw the same patterns repeating. The operators were following procedures correctly, but they weren't adapting their approach based on the specific challenges they were facing. It was the difference between memorizing recipes and understanding how to cook. During the lunch break, Petty Officer Thompson approached her directly. "Commander Morrison tells me you have some observations about our training scenarios." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but Thompson's tone was genuinely curious rather than defensive. "I've noticed a few patterns that might be worth discussing," she said carefully. "I'd like to hear them. We're always looking for ways to improve our program." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah found herself in an intense discussion about training methodology and scenario design. Thompson was clearly knowledgeable and experienced, but he was also genuinely interested in her perspective. As they talked, Sarah realized that her concerns weren't about the quality of the instruction, but about the gap between training and reality. "The scenarios are technically accurate," she explained, "but they're not capturing the psychological pressure and decision-making challenges that operators will face in the field. When everything is chaos and you have seconds to make choices that will determine who lives and dies, technical knowledge isn't enough." Thompson nodded slowly. "How would you address that?" "Stress inoculation training that goes beyond noise and time pressure. Scenarios where there are no perfect solutions, where operators have to live with the consequences of difficult decisions. Training that prepares them for the emotional weight of combat medicine, not just the procedures." When the afternoon session resumed, Thompson made an unexpected announcement. "We're going to modify today's scenario based on some new input. Sergeant Martinez will be observing and providing feedback during the exercise." Sarah felt a moment of panic as 8 pairs of eyes turned toward her. These were some of the most elite soldiers in the world, and she was about to critique their performance while sitting in a wheelchair. But as the scenario began, her focus shifted entirely to the medical situation unfolding before her. The modified scenario was deliberately more complex and stressful than the morning exercises. Multiple casualties with conflicting priority levels, equipment failures, and time constraints that forced difficult decisions. As Sarah watched, she began calling out observations and guidance. "Operator 3, you're spending too much time on that chest wound. Given your resources and timeline, consider a less invasive approach that conserves supplies for other casualties. The casualty in the corner has been stable for 15 minutes, but watch for signs of internal bleeding. Don't let stable fool you into thinking safe." Her voice carried the authority of experience, and she was surprised to see the operators responding positively to her guidance. They began adapting their approach based on her suggestions, and their performance improved noticeably. When the exercise concluded, the room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the operators, a grizzled sergeant with multiple deployment patches, spoke up. "Ma'am, that was the most realistic training scenario I've experienced. The way you called those decisions matched exactly what I faced during my last deployment in Syria." Other operators nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt a warmth she hadn't experienced since before her injury. These elite soldiers respected her knowledge and experience, seeing her as a valuable instructor rather than a disabled veteran who needed accommodation. Commander Morrison joined the group as they conducted their after-action review. "What you just experienced," he told the operators, "is the kind of training we want to integrate into our program. Sergeant Martinez brings a level of practical experience that helps bridge the gap between classroom knowledge and field reality." As the day ended, Sarah found herself energized in a way she hadn't felt for months. She had contributed something meaningful, had used her experience to help prepare soldiers for situations that could save lives. The work felt important and necessary. Thompson approached her as she prepared to leave. "I hope you'll consider staying on permanently. This program needs someone with your background and teaching ability." Sarah smiled, feeling more confident than she had since her injury. "I think I'd like that very much." For the first time since the explosion that changed her life, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. She was serving again, teaching again, and making a difference in ways she had never imagined possible. The future that had seemed so uncertain just weeks ago was beginning to take shape, and it looked better than anything she could have planned. 6 months later, Sarah wheeled herself into the familiar training room for what had become her favorite part of the week, the final exercise for a new group of special operations medics. The room that had once felt intimidating now felt like home, filled with equipment she had helped select and scenarios she had designed based on real-world experiences. The 8 operators standing before her represented the culmination of weeks of intensive training. Unlike the confident, seasoned medics she had first observed, these were newer special operations personnel who had arrived, uncertain and nervous about the advanced medical training they were about to receive. Today's scenario will test everything you've learned over the past month, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority that had developed naturally over months of teaching. You'll be responding to a complex mass casualty event with limited resources, no immediate evacuation, and multiple complicating factors. She had learned to design scenarios that pushed operators beyond their comfort zones while remaining realistic and educational. Each exercise was based on actual situations she or her colleagues had faced, modified to create specific learning objectives while respecting the classified nature of some operations. Remember, she continued, your goal is not to save everyone. Your goal is to make the best decisions possible with the information and resources available. Sometimes that means making choices that feel wrong, but are strategically correct. The scenario began with a simulated rocket attack on a forward operating base, multiple casualties with varying injury severity, damaged medical equipment, and incoming intelligence about potential follow-up attacks that could disrupt treatment. As the operators began their response, Sarah moved through the training area, observing their decision-making process and providing real-time guidance. Johnson, talk me through your triage decisions, she called out to one of the operators who was hesitating between 2 casualties. The head injury is more severe, but with our resource limitations and the evacuation timeline, I think I can stabilize the abdominal wound and increase our overall save rate, he responded. Continuing to work as he spoke, Sarah nodded approvingly. 6 months ago, that kind of strategic thinking under pressure had been rare among the operators she observed. Now it was becoming standard, a shift that she took pride in having helped facilitate. As the exercise continued, Sarah found herself thinking about how much had changed since that first terrifying day, when she wasn't sure if the operators would respect her knowledge or see her only as a disabled veteran. The transformation had been gradual but profound, built on consistent demonstrations of competence and value, rather than dramatic gestures. The operators had accepted her not because they felt sorry for her circumstances, but because she consistently provided training that made them better at their jobs. Her wheelchair had become invisible, irrelevant to the knowledge and experience she brought to their preparation. Commander Morrison entered the training area as the scenario reached its climax. He often observed these final exercises, partly to evaluate the program's effectiveness, but also, Sarah suspected, because he enjoyed seeing the transformation in the operators who completed the training. Martinez, how is this group performing compared to previous classes? He asked quietly. Better decision-making under pressure, more adaptive thinking, and improved stress management, Sarah replied, watching as the operators efficiently managed a complex casualty evacuation. This group has really embraced the principle-based approach rather than just memorizing procedures. The exercise concluded with a comprehensive after-action review where each operator analyzed their decisions and identified areas for improvement. Sarah had learned that this reflection process was as important as the training itself, helping operators understand not just what they had done, but why they had made specific choices. Sergeant Williams, walk us through your resource allocation decisions during the second phase of the scenario, Sarah prompted. Williams, a young operator who had struggled with confidence at the beginning of the course, stood and presented a clear analysis of his decision-making process. His transformation over the month of training had been particularly dramatic, evolving from someone who followed orders precisely to someone who could adapt and improvise under pressure. I prioritized casualties based on survivability rather than injury severity, he explained. With our limited supplies and the delayed evacuation, I focused on patients I could stabilize effectively, rather than attempting procedures that might fail and waste resources. Sarah smiled, recognizing her own teaching in his words, but also seeing the personal growth that came from applying those concepts under stress. This was why she had been drawn to combat medicine originally, the opportunity to make decisions that directly saved lives. and now the chance to teach others to do the same. As the class concluded, several operators approached her individually to express their appreciation for the training. These conversations had become routine, but they never lost their impact on Sarah. Each thank you represented lives that might be saved in future operations, knowledge that would be applied in situations she would never hear about. "Ma'am, this training changed how I think about everything," one operator told her. "Not just medical situations, but decision-making under pressure in general. Thank you for pushing us to think differently." After the operators departed, Sarah remained in the training room for a few minutes, reflecting on the day and the larger journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she had been struggling with basic physical therapy and questioning whether her life had any purpose beyond recovery. Now she was leading one of the most advanced combat medical training programs in the military, teaching skills that would directly impact mission success and operator survival. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that exceeded even her military service. Commander Morrison joined her as she gathered her materials. "The program evaluation results came back from headquarters," he said. "Operators who complete your training show a 40% improvement in performance metrics compared to the previous curriculum." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but also responsibility. Success meant that more operators would be depending on the training she provided, that the decisions she made about curriculum and scenarios would have real-world consequences. "I've been thinking about expanding the program," Morrison continued. "Other special operations units are requesting similar training, and there's talk of incorporating your methods into the broader military medical curriculum." The suggestion was both exciting and overwhelming. Sarah had found her place in this specific program, but the idea of broader influence felt like stepping into entirely new territory. "I'd like to consider it," she said carefully, "but I want to make sure we maintain the quality and practical focus that makes this program effective." As she drove home that evening, Sarah thought about the conversation she had scheduled with Dr. Williams later that week. The counseling sessions had evolved from discussions about coping with loss to conversations about managing success and handling new challenges. She thought about the email she had received from her former commanding officer, congratulating her on articles she had published about combat medical training and asking for her input on military medical doctrine. She thought about the operators who stayed in touch, sending updates about how the training had helped them in real situations. Most of all, she thought about the 17 lives she had saved during her deployments, and the countless others that might be saved by operators she had trained. Her service hadn't ended with her injury. It had evolved into something she couldn't have imagined, but that felt perfectly suited to who she had become. Sarah Martinez had learned that purpose wasn't defined by what you could physically do, but by how you used your knowledge and experience to serve something larger than yourself. Her journey from wounded soldier to elite instructor had taught her that endings could become beginnings, and that sometimes the most meaningful service came after you thought your service was over. The room had fallen quiet when she first arrived, uncertain and afraid. Now it fell quiet out of respect, as operators absorbed lessons that might save their lives and the lives of others. Sarah had found her voice again, and it was stronger than ever.